Hi, I'm Amanda,
I'm Haley.
and we're going to be talking about police organization and operation.
So I'm going to start talking about the peak articles, so chapters 4, 5, and 6, starting with police agencies as organizations. So an organization is an artificial structure created to coordinate people or groups and resources to achieve a mission or goal. And police agencies at this time generally fit that description. Police administrators modify or design the structure of the organizations to fulfill their missions. So organizational structure reflects the formal and organizational task and authority. Chiefs, middle managers, and first line supervisors work to ensure unit work to reach a common goal. So moving into division of labor, the larger an agency, the greater need for specialization, and specialization or a division of labor is basically a feature or traditional organizational theory where specialization produces different groups of functional responsibilities. So basically saying jobs given based on responsibilities and qualifications. This can make the organization more complex, and there's a need for coordination. When it comes to advantages of division of labor, there's placement of responsibility, development of expertise, group esprit de corps, and increased efficiency and effectiveness. Going into police organizational structure. Organizational structure is how an organization divides up their work and establishes lines of authority and communication. There are 7 elements to the law enforcement of organizational structure, including functional differentiation, occupational differentiation, spatial differentiation, vertical differentiation, which includes segmentation, concentration, and height, concentration, formalization, and administrative intensity. Traditionally structured among military lines, they can maintain a chain of command that way. So structure continued. Police structures are designed to fulfill 5 functions: distributing workload among members or units with a logical plan, lines of authority and responsibility are definite and direct, specify unity of command, responsibility with authority, and coordinate efforts to accomplish a goal. Looking at organizational guidelines, agencies or services are oriented in nature. They're well-defined specific guidelines to ensure officers conform to behavior, and they're there to enhance public protection. They have broad discretion, so it gives them the opportunity to settle issues informally and work against them because it's narrow and there's inflexible job requirements. As far as policy goes, more general than procedures served as basic guidelines to the organizational philosophy and mission to help interpreting their elements for officers. When it comes to procedure, they're more specific than policy and they serve as guides to action. For instance, method of operation, allowing some flexibility within limits. Rules and regulations are managerial guidelines that leave little to no latitude for individual discretion, which isn't always popular and may seem unfair depending on what it is. So moving into community-oriented policing and problem-solving, COPPS or COPS. The management style and organizational strategy that promotes proactive problem-solving and police-community partnerships to address the causes of crime and fear, as well as other community issues. So along with this is the SARA process, which is scanning, analysis, responsive assessment, which provide officers with logical steps with a step-by-step framework in which to identify, and it helps them in responding to crimes and evaluating in order to help in neighborhood disorders. Emphasis on in-depth analysis and collaboration is basically a big part of the SARA process. So looking at changes after 9/11, there were 2 broad changes. There was a shift in emphasis from community policing to homeland security, and there was an economic downturn beginning in the late 200s, which led to changes in how people were recruited and hired. There was a greater collaboration and multi-jurisdictional sharing of resources and less face-to-face contact with the public. There were some paradigm shifts, including agencies de-emphasize community policing efforts and shift attention towards HSP. There was smart policing introduced, intelligence policing, and predictive policing. So looking at the federalization and militarization in police departments, federalization is the centralization or loss of local political control. the federal law enforcement agencies basically taking over local agencies. And militarization is using military-style weapons, tactics, training uniforms, and heavy equipment by civilian police departments. So going into Chapter 5, Police Personnel and Roles and Functions. So it starts off talking about the Mintzberg model for CEOs, which there are 3 primary roles: the interpersonal, the informational, and the decision maker. So the interpersonal role has to talk about the figurehead, leadership, and liaison duties of a CEO. Informational is the monitor and inspection, the dissemination and spokesperson duties. And the decision maker is the entrepreneur, disturbance handler, and resource allocator and negotiator aspects of a CEO. For law enforcement executives, assessment centers is a process used for promoting and hiring personnel, so that way they can effectively hire useful people, including oral interviews, psych tests, writing and role-playing exercises, as well as many other tests. And this is done to obtain the most capable people for executive positions. And looking at skills for a good manager, they need technical skills, human skills, and conceptual skills. So there are said to be 10 commandments for police execs, which include practice what you preach, a day's pay for a day and a half of work, maintain and promote integrity, develop a positive image, remain committed, be respectful, accept assistance from others, be eager for knowledge, maintain a healthy lifestyle, and set personal goals. When it comes to the chief of police, they're the top official in a chain of command for a municipal police department, and they're expected to do a lot of things, including promoting departmental efficiency, reducing crime, improving service, communicating with city management, establishing policies, goals, and objectives, and promoting organizational objectives. A lot of the times they have a relatively short tenure, around 5.4 years, and this can be due to a lot of things. Some people don't care for the position, but losing the position also just is not very difficult to do. There's instances of confrontation, shaky alliance, and politicized organization as a whole, which can end up getting people out of that position. The next is the sheriff, so the top official in the chain of command of a county law enforcement agency, and their duties include serving, implementing the civil process, collecting certain taxes and conducting real estate sales for a county, performing routine order maintenance, serving as bailiff in courts, and maintaining and operating county correctional institutions, among others. They have a unique role because they serve 3 components of the criminal justice system, including law enforcement, courts, and corrections. And they're elected into their position, so the position usually is very political in nature. When looking at captains and lieutenants, they basically are a part of a coordinating agency. They get together activities, they see administrative strategies, and the missions are carried out. So generally these are the middle management people. They report to higher ups, but they're also supervising subordinates. There's 15 important tasks for captions that are mentioned, but I'll just mention a couple of them, including preparing routine reports, ensuring subordinates comply with general and special orders, that they monitor crime and activity statistics, and monitor section operations and evaluate performance. And there's also 15 tasks that are mentioned for lieutenants, but again, I'll just go over a couple of them, including assisting and supervising and directing activities, perform duties of police officers, review work of individuals in section, and notify captain or bureau commander of significant calls. Now going to the first line supervisors, the patrol sergeant. They're the lowest in terms of supervisors, but they have a very important level of leadership. They're kind of caught between upper management and the rank and file officers. And these individuals are usually promoted within the ranks. Good patrol officers don't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good supervisor. They have several tasks, obviously, as well, including disseminating information to subordinates, listening to problems voiced by officers, and supervising officers. There's 4 types of patrol sergeants. There's the traditional, which is law enforcement oriented, innovative, which is closely associated with community policing, basically wanting to develop relationships with their subordinates, supportive, where they also want a relationship with their subordinate, but they mainly have the idea that they want to protect against unfair management practices for their subordinates, and active, which they are working in the field. They're taking charge as many places as they can. Looking at just the patrol officers, they have many tasks that they have to take care of, including enforcing the law, performing services, preventing crime, and protecting the innocent. Good officers require a lot of different qualities, including being incorruptible, well-adjusted, thick-skinned, and people-oriented. Several other qualities can include being a good communicator, having good judgment, being creative, needing a sense of humor, and being courageous. So now going into Chapter 6, Police Issues and Practices. First, looking at terrorism. The FBI defines terrorism as unlawful use of force against persons or property to intimidate or coerce government, the civilian populations, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political, social objectives. There's 3 categories. So foreign sponsors of international terrorism, which basically countries designate sponsors and they're viewed as a tool for foreign policy. Formalized terrorist groups, which are autonomous organizations and have their own infrastructure, finances, and things like that. And then loosely affiliated international radical extremists who don't really represent any particular nation, and they can be the biggest threat to the US because they're really unknown. They're not as apparent. Another issue is bioterrorism, which are terrorist acts which utilize biological agents to produce sickness, disease, and death. These are really dangerous because they can basically eradicate entire civilizations through these illnesses. And one positive to this is the fact that they're a little difficult to carry out, just because when working with such small cells and things like that, it can be difficult to put them through travel and all of those sorts of things. So looking at political/legislative responses, there's the Posse Comitatus, which is military support of law enforcement. So basically, in certain instances, law enforcement can have the military come in as a type of support. There's the National Incident Management System, which is a nationwide system, and it takes an approach from the federal, state, and local government to work effectively together, basically to prepare, prevent, respond to, and recover from domestic incidents. The USA Patriot Act, which investigates Americans without establishing probable cause from intelligence purposes, and they can conduct searches on reasonable grounds, and there is not whenever there is a national security threat. And then the Military Commissions Act of 2006, where a president is authorized to establish military commissions to try unlawful enemy combatants. Another thing that came out of this was fusion centers, which coordinate all responses and counterterrorism elements within community areas. So allowing for more comprehensive planning and better coordination should a terrorist event occur. Basically bringing communication together from different areas in order to have more openness. Looking at cyber terrorism. So there's cybercrime or cyber terrorism, which includes a lot of different things, including identity theft, attacks against computer data and systems, distribution of child sexual abuse images, internet action fraud, penetration of online financial services, employment of viruses, email scams, and phishing, and this has been seen to be one of the fastest growing areas of crime. When managing use of force, which was the next topic that was discussed in the chapter, force is defined by the IACP as an amount of effort required by police to compel compliance with an unwilling subject. So officers are given a large amount of authority to use against citizens, including lethal force. And in return for this police power/authority given, there's an expectation to use this judiciously and as a last resort. But issues can arise when the force is improperly used. There are 3 types of abuse of authority. There's physical abuse, excessive force, so hitting someone, something along those lines. Verbal and psychological abuse, which the text mentions as being one of the more common ways that police will use force. And then legal abuse and violations of civil rights. So when it comes to the type of officer that uses more force, Research has indicated that those with higher arrest rates, so the individuals who are arresting more people in comparison to those who are having lower arrest rates, are more likely to use force. Those working certain shifts, so people working evenings or nights, are usually more likely to end up using force. Male officers over female officers are usually the ones using force. And location has been found to play a factor. So in high crime areas, they usually foster conditions where force is more frequently needed or necessary. So when it comes to policy implications, the text mentions a couple, talking about adopting an early warning system. So basically, if there's any sort of red flags that are coming up, try to address those as quickly as possible, just because it may down the line be something where an officer would use more force. They may also reconsider using the newest and least experienced officers to work the night shifts or have someone experienced supervise them, because if you're putting in a new officer into a situation where there's been seen to have a higher use of force, you may want somebody who's a little bit more comfortable with policing than somebody who's just brand new out of the academy. And then the last suggestion was a greater integration of women into the force, which is kind of a stretch just from the point that if there can be difficulty with recruiting women, it may not be easy just to add more women in. So there's a use of force continuum, which is a depiction basically of levels of force used by police to determine the type of force that is appropriate for certain types of citizen resistance. So since officers do need to be objectively reasonable, which is based on the totality of circumstances known or perceived at the time that the force was used, there's basically like a diagram that they can kind of use called the Dynamic Resistance Response Model, the DRRM, which can help you in a flowchart type of way to find the proper way of applying force to gain compliance needed. So going into contracting and consolidating, contracting policing is basically when smaller community will contract with an outside unit of government to provide policing services. So maybe they won't have their own police, but have somebody come in for them. And then there's consolidation, which is the merging of two or more city and or county law enforcement agencies into a single entity. And the goal is basically to avoid duplication of costly services. So it's basically cutting costs and streamlining services as a way to cut out overlap. So when it comes to planning for the future, there's a succession for planning, which is identifying and developing employees who have a potential to fill leadership positions. Agencies can provide skill development opportunities for those with leadership potential. So they can be offered to plan an event, write a training bulletin, update policies and procedures, conduct training research, counsel peers, and become a mentor. So those are things that can be provided to them. But then the individual can also establish plans for themselves. So they can try to add some academic coursework in to get themselves a better education, participate in lead civic events, and attend training sessions. So going into uniforms and appearance, there is a dress code, obviously, for police officers. A dress code is a set of rules usually written as a policy specifying required manner of dress and appearance for employees. So a police uniform can do a lot. It can convey power and authority. It can identify a person with the power to arrest and use force. It can establish order, create conformity, but at the same time, it also can suppress individuality. So dress code also addresses things like hair length, facial hair, sunglasses, and tattoos. So for police officers, that's more specifically geared. So they may only be able to have a certain length of hair. They may or may not be able to have facial hair. They may only be able to wear certain sunglasses. Usually they're not allowed to wear reflective sunglasses. And when it comes to tattoos, a lot of the times they can't have anything showing on them.
So knowing what we know about police operations and constraints, we're going to move into the Warden article, which talks about situational and attitudinal explanations of police behavior. So policing we see as kind of like mechanical and just enforcing the law. However, policing can also be extra legal. We talked about the extra legal variables such as race, gender, things like that, because while they are working within the law, they rarely invoke the law if they don't have to while performing their police work. They use their discretion. They can choose outside of the law. So if a cop pulls someone over who's speeding, maybe he doesn't give them a ticket, even though the law would say, if they're going over 10 miles an hour of the speed limit, like you have to give them a ticket. Maybe they don't. Maybe they use their discretion in that. Past research that has talked about police discretion has mainly focused on two different approaches. The first approach would be the situational factors, which say that officers' behavior in police-citizen encounters are influenced by structural factors. So they take into account the immediate situation and they assess what their next move is from there. This approach is grounded in a sociological perspective, mostly like on social control. And they talk about the likelihood of formal action being invoked by the officers depends on a couple factors such as the severity of the offense, visibility of the suspect, characteristics of the victim, such as those extra legal variables we talked about earlier, and the relationship between the parties if there is a dispute happening. They also talk about organizational demands, which can be situational pressures that affect the way an officer will respond to a certain situation. There's a presumption that officers exercise complete autonomy in their task and that their job is clearly defined and well understood. This is a very common misconception. Most of the time there isn't that much autonomy over what they do. There's a lot of policies, procedures that dictate what the officer needs to do, and sometimes their job description isn't well informed. Are they dealing with maintaining order? Are they suppressing crime? Are they dealing with quality of life situations on the street more? There's kind of a ambiguous stance on things like that. Officers are usually guided by like a rule of thumb when talking about their actions, and these are consistently applied. So they tend to practice individual styles of policing from that. The other approach that research usually takes is the attitudinal explanations, and this says that they develop distinct styles while performing their duties, and they develop these based on their attitudes and their values. Some of these, they say it creates a typology of police officers, and they talk about 4 different typologies, which are the professional officer, the reciprocator officer, enforcer, and the avoider. However, a large body of social psychological research has shown that people's attitudes are usually only weakly related to their behavior. But this article kind of dives into that a little bit more just to explore whether that is or is not the case. In our criminal justice system, sometimes we try and ask ourselves, do we see either the situational approach or the attitudinal factors, or is it like a mix of both? Sometimes you see it as a mix of both. Sometimes when an officer pulls someone over, it might depend on the situation, no matter how the officer feels, his attitudes, beliefs, values. But then you do have those officers who kind of go off of their attitudes and values to kind of guide in what they do next. The problem with these two approaches is that they fall short in accounting for officer behavior. There's ambiguity and uncertainty can weaken these relationships between these situational factors and the officer's attitudes. Another problem is that they fail to capture the premises for officers' decisions. So one might observe variation in officers' choices among alternative choices, courses of actions, even in situations with similar meaning for the officers. There's a lot of subjectivity in these approaches. So they suggest that a theory of police behavior must incorporate all these organizational factors. So when talking about the decision-making of police officers, they talk about the administrative man. And this administrative man is said to engage in limited searches for courses of action that yield satisfactory outcomes. There's only a limited capacity for processing and analyzing information. Their rationality is bounded, and they use a simple picture of the situation and take into account only few factors that they deem relevant to make their decision. So their decision is primarily influenced by either obtrusive means or unobtrusive means. The obtrusive means are the formal controls. So these are your rules, your procedures that officers are expected to follow. Some of these procedures the officers might not agree with, or they may affect the way they do their work, but they still are expected to follow them. And then we have the unobtrusive means, which are things like training, socialization, specialization. So this is the officer actually on the job, with his partner, with other officers, learning and picking up on how to react to different situations. They also talk about the police culture being a huge factor in making decisions as well. So they have police culture as like the code that police abide by. And it's a set of assumptions about police work that is widely held and shared by officers. So they talk about the extent that officers internalize the code, the police culture shapes their attitudes, and then the extent to which officers abide by the code, the police culture influences their decision premises. However, the code is ambiguous, so it allows for a lot of interpretation, so that's where we see a lot of variation in how police actually respond. Even though there is this code, there's a set of policy procedures, things like that, and there's a lot of variation within the department, so a lot of variation in like your vertical complexity, and then there's a lot of variation across departments, so a lot of variation in your horizontal complexity as well. So they talk about an empirical assessment of situational and attitudinal explanations show that they account for only a small portion of the variation in officers' behaviors. So that's kind of why they wanted to do this study. They wanted to analyze that role a little bit more. So what they did is they broke police behavior down into 3 different domains. They looked at traffic enforcement as well as aggressive preventive patrol, which is one or more number of tactics intended to increase the probability that offenders will be apprehended, or just to create the illusion thereof that to deter future criminals. And then the last domain, they looked at interpersonal disputes. And a dispute is a complex situation that requires for a resolution, but it has a lot of different contingencies attached to it, such as the subject of the dispute, the relationship between the disputants, is the dispute rooted in previous or more deeply rooted conflict, or is this dispute a discrete incident? So they look at 2 different forms of proactivity. They look at traffic stops and suspicious stops, and they look at 2 forms of disposition. They look at it in traffic stops and look at it in interpersonal disputes. So things like domestic violence calls and things like that. So unless the funny thing about police behavior and why there really needs to be a study about it where the researchers follow the police officers and kind of record and observe what's going on is unless a case enters the criminal justice system where it's reviewed by other officials, the nature of an officer's response is known only to the parties that are present. This is that blue wall that comes up where police work is kind of, mysterious. You don't really know all the aspects of it, especially if police officers are using their discretion, and a lot of cases don't require a formal action. A lot of it doesn't get seen by anybody other than the parties present, maybe some bystanders, things like that. So what the authors of the study did, they took a sample of 24 police departments in 3 different metropolitan areas, looking at 60 neighborhoods. This is a kind of a wide generalizability. They looked at a lot of different variety of police departments. They have different areas and a lot of different neighborhoods, so that allows them to get like a better idea of what actually is going on in different neighborhoods, not just one select type of neighborhood. So what the observers did, they accompanied the officers on their patrols, and they observed police-citizen encounters, and they recorded it. And on top of that, they passed out questionnaires to the officers in each department. So looking at their proactivity, the authors found that on average, the officers made 1 suspicious stop every 3 shifts. Looking at the dispositions, they noticed that the officers rarely evoked formal action, and no one actually expected the officers to either. Half of their stops by the officers, they took no action more serious than just giving the violator a verbal warning. So if they were speeding, just saying, hey, slow down next time, or if they go to a dispute, kind of just talk it out, give them a warning, and no actual response was taken. In additional 10%, they issued a written warning. And then the remaining stops, which were just a few, the officers issued a ticket. But they didn't note anything more serious than that. They didn't note any arrests, any calls for backup, nothing like that. Most of them were simply, slow down next time, here's a verbal warning, and then they went on their way. They also noted 4 approaches to dispute resolution. The first one was mediation. So this is, talking it out, working on a compromise between both parties, and then they go on their way. The other one is separation. So this involves separating the disputants by persuading one of the parties to leave for a little bit of time. This is more common in like domestic violence and different disputes where the disputants might know each other. They have a relationship, either their family, they're married, brother, sister, things like that. However, it doesn't have a lasting solution, which is a problem. So if you you convince the husband who's screaming or hitting his wife to just walk out of the house for a little bit, you're stopping and interrupting that dispute, but you're really not doing anything to resolve the situation. He may come back, just as mad, maybe even more mad, and it's not really a long-term solution. But it can be good just to kind of interrupt the dispute and kind of figure out your next step from there. There's coercion, which is the potential or the actual use of legal authority. So this is when officers use their legitimate power or coercive power that we talked about in the previous class. And this is either maybe threatening to arrest somebody or actually arresting somebody, but the officers have the power in this situation, and they have the ability to either threaten or actually use these tactics to stop a dispute. And then the last one, that's not as commonly seen in the criminal justice system. It's becoming more common as we go towards a more rehabilitative approach, but that's the counseling. And this is providing the parties with either information about filing charges, a referral to another agency, or giving them some assurance in like what the next steps are and what the process really is. So they go back to talking about the situational factors. They talk about control as being very important. They talk about the number of opportunities to make traffic stops is an important function based on the volume of traffic. So looking at these, it's important to realize that some shifts may not have the same amount of traffic, so they might not have the same amount of opportunity to pull someone over and then make decisions after they pull them over. This may account for disparities that are seen in other research where different minorities may get pulled over more, or different genders may get pulled over more, things like that. Because if you think about it, there may be more traffic in a city, so there's more opportunity to pull someone over in a city, and you might just happen to have a larger minority population in that city. So that kind of brings to light maybe some of the disparities in other research, which was just important to note that they brought out in this research as well. They also talk about the opportunities to pull someone over depends on an officer's discretionary time. And what that is, it's uncommitted time to assign tasks. So if an officer is doing paperwork at the office, if he's responding to calls of service, if he has, different stops he has to make, he doesn't have as much time to pull someone over. If he's on his way to go answer a call for service and he sees someone speeding, he's not going to pull them over because he's already doing something. So they said that officers that have little discretionary time are the ones that are occupied by these calls of service. They also talk about, on an average 8-hour shift, about 2/3, which goes to about 5.5 hours, was discretionary time. So these officers had a decent amount of their time on shift as discretionary time to make stops, make suspicious stops, pull people over for speeding, but traffic violations, things like that. It's also important to note that traffic may be different in shifts and different beats as well. They looked at mainly 6 kinds of traffic violations in the data. They looked at driving under the influence, speeding, moving violations, improper license plates or registrations, equipment or inspection violations, and violation of local ordinances. The stops for routine checks and DUIs were found to be infrequent. Disputes when in traffic stops were characterized by either an argument, which was just a disagreement that stopped short of violence. There was no actual violence involved. A fight where actual physical contact was made. An assault where there's a physical attack by one person upon another with no weapon present. And then they had aggravated assault, which is that same physical attack but with the presence of a weapon. Disputes that transpired in public were found to be more likely to have a coercive response attached to them, which makes sense if you think about it, because if there's a disturbance, say, on the street, or if there's a disturbance in like a local park, the police kind of want to get that resolved as soon as possible. So it might be more effective to just use their legitimate power, maybe arrest them, take them to the station, and then figure that out once they're there, because they just kind of want to use that maintain order and kind of get everybody out of the public area at the moment. They also saw that presence of bystanders affects the severity of officers' treatment of suspects, which makes sense because the police want to look good. They want to preserve that legitimacy of the police department. They have a certain standard to uphold. So if they see something go on and they just kind of let it go, but there's bystanders there that also see them let it go, they might say, oh, the police don't do anything here. They don't do their job. Or they kind of want to maintain their respect and legitimacy in their community. When moving on to the officer attitudes and attitudinal factors, they talk about a number of aspects that affect the behavior and attitudes of police officers. One of them is their role orientation. So this consists of officers' conceptions of the proper and legitimate scope of police business. So some of the issues lie where police think, oh, my job is just law enforcement and to suppress crime. And they narrow in on that instead of taking a more broader approach to the role of police officers. They mentioned Brown, 1981, in their study, and his data found that role orientation had a substantial effect on police aggressiveness. Officers who had a narrow scope of role orientation emphasized the enforcement function, and they were more aggressive in stopping suspicious people. They draw the boundaries of their job around the law enforcement function, so minor disputes fall outside of their definition of the police responsibilities, so they narrow in on certain crimes while letting others go unnoticed. The broader role orientations tend to adopt non-coercive strategies as well. Another aspect that affects the attitudes of law enforcement are legal restrictions. So a lot of officers tend to overlook the due process provisions and single-minded pursuit of criminal offenders. So they don't see the whole process of, making sure those suspected of a crime, their civil rights are being upheld. They're just kind of, I think he did this, I need to get him off the street and I need to suppress crime. And they just kind of overlook the whole due process part of their jobs. They say some officers resent legal restrictions and they're willing to violate them because they think they hinder their jobs, while others are willing to work within those restrictions and they don't really feel constrained by them. Aggressive patrol has constitutional limits, so an officer has a reasonable cause to stop a citizen. He can't just stop a citizen on the street or just pull over someone driving for no reason if they're not speeding, or if they're doing everything right. He can't just stop them because he thinks they look like they're doing something wrong when in actuality they're not. So they do have to work within some kind of legal restrictions, which may be frustrating, which may shape how they tend to respond to situations as well. They may not be as aggressive in their pursuits because of these legal restrictions. They don't want to step outside their boundary. Another aspect is citizen respect and cooperation. So many police officers believe that police are held in low regard by the general public. They believe that the public is uncooperative and hostile. Officers that have this cynical look on the public are disinclined to believe that citizens are respectful and cooperative. And then they're reluctant to stop traffic law violators because they find it unpleasant or fear that the motorist might file a complaint against them. They just kind of don't want to even interact with them because they're like, oh, the public's terrible. I don't want to even stop them because they're going to be videotaping me on my phone, on their phone. They're going to be trying to take my badge number. They're going to try and report me for stuff, and they don't even want any parts of that. But they also might be more energetic about enforcing laws because, you know, the public's horrible. Like, I don't really like interacting with the public. They're doing stuff wrong. They should have to pay for that. That kind of look comes into play as well. They also might limit to rely on their coercive strategies, which is invoking their, you know, legitimate power. Legal action may be more attractive to those who believe citizens are likely to follow through on an arrest. Another aspect is legal institutions. So many officers believe that legal institutions are uncooperative and unsupportive. So things like the courts, a lot of officers believe the courts are soft on crime. We hear that all the time. But that's mainly because they don't understand or they choose not to focus on the due process aspect of it. Officers who believe that the prosecutors and judges do not support them may be less likely to be of little consequence. So officers who believe that they are supported by neither the courts nor the prosecutor may be unwilling to make suspicious stops without demonstrable cause. They don't want the constitutionality of their stop to get questioned, and they don't want to look bad in court. So if they're called to court to testify about something, they don't want to look stupid later because now they're being questioned about the legitimacy of their stop. So they're going to be less likely because they think the courts not necessarily are against them, but they're not there to like help them and guide them through it. So they don't even want any parts of it. They might be, you know, more reluctant to make these kind of stops because they don't want to be questioned later. The last aspect is selective enforcement. So selectivity is a predisposition to array criminal offenses along a scale of priorities and to define a point on that scale below which laws are too unimportant to enforce. So officers in their head might have a scale that they made and they might mark a point for themselves. And it's like, okay, so for traffic violations, if they're going 15 miles per hour above the speed limit, that's my point. That's when I'm going to pull them over. Anything under that, it's fine. I'm not going to pull them over. I'm not going to give them a ticket. That's an example of selectivity. So non-selectivity would be enforcing all of the laws. So if you're speeding 5 miles over the speed limit, I'm going to give you a ticket. They don't select which ones they're going to do. So selective officers seldom invoke the law. They tend to use more informal methods. And this is important to understand because this can affect what we'll talk about in the next article about the victim's view of law enforcement and the treatment of victims. Someone who has selectivity and they're using discretion in how they interact with victims or how they take the situations may affect how that victim's gonna react to the officer. So traffic stops, in regards to proactivity, they found fewer traffic stops are made on the graveyard shifts, which are between 10 p.m. and midnight, which goes back to what I was saying about how some shifts just don't have a lot of traffic, so there's less opportunity. It also found that the officers' attitudes actually had a small influence on proactivity in traffic enforcement. They generally didn't affect the way they pulled people over and things like that. Officers who believe that citizens are respectful tended to be more proactive in their responses, which kind of brings you to believe like they don't mind interacting with the public because they believe that they are respectful and they do have that respect for the law enforcement officers. So they don't mind interacting with them. They don't think the interaction is going to be something that's terrible. In regards to suspicious stops, officers are more proactive during evening shifts than they are during the day shifts. And I read this and I thought, that's weird. I wonder why that is. And then I got to thinking, well, the evening shifts, maybe that's when they see more illegal activity happening or they see more suspicious people hanging out in the streets because kids are out of school. People are generally done work, so there's a lot more activity on the streets. So that could be the reason for this as well. But the authors really don't go into exactly why they saw this. In regard to dispositions, in traffic stops, situational factors and officer attitudes together only had a moderate influence on the behaviors that the officers ended up taking. Situational factors, especially the nature of the offense, contributed to the most to whatever discrimination this function makes possible. And as far as disputes, situational factors affected officers' decision to arrest, but that officers' choices among other responses weren't seen as to be as strong. So it mainly only affected whether they were going to arrest the officer or not, or the offender or not, which kind of makes sense because the situational factors, they're in the situation, they're looking at different aspects of the situation, such as the characteristics of the offender, the severity of the crime, things like that. So those are the kind of aspects that the officer really needs to take into account. They may let this person go, say it's, a kid who maybe tried to tag a wall or something like that, and he has, he's respectful to the cop. No, he's not out there causing trouble. He's not in a big group of people. The officer may just let him go. Or if it's someone, rolls up, he's very disrespectful to the cop. He's trying to run. He's trying to, assault the officer. Like, those are the things that are going to affect whether the officers actually arrest somebody or not. So that finding did actually make sense as well. So overall, the results in this article were generally consistent with previous research. Situational factors had a significant effect on officers' decisions to arrest, but they were less likely to impact an officer's choices among other informal actions. The implications with this include that, both empirical and theoretical reasons to expect that officers' behavior cannot be predicted on the basis of their attitude. They may be highly dedicated to the rules of their organization. So even though they believe something, or they have these predisposition, or they're predisposed to think a certain way or whatever it may be, they may just be very dedicated to their organization and their policies and procedures that they have to follow. So that may be why it didn't have such a great effect on them as well. However, the author still came up with that the explanations of situational and attitudinal factors are incomplete still. So they discussed two different approaches that could be taken to kind of come back at this. So they said that you could analyze patterns of officers' behavior across individual departments and identify inductively structural characteristics that account for behavior. So they talk a lot about the formal structures of the police organization, such as recruitment practices, horizontal and vertical specialization, and the criteria for evaluating personnel. They vary accordingly from department to department, and it can be manipulated by chiefs to serve their objective. Another approach that can be taken is a protocol analysis. So protocols are verbal reports of the cognitive steps taken to solve problems and to make decisions. So subjects would be asked to either think aloud or, write down hypothetical decisions based on hypothetical situations. The only problem I see with this, and we've talked about before, it's not really a true measure of what someone would do. You can bring up a hypothetical situation all day, especially with police work. It's a little bit difficult because you're in the moment, your adrenaline's going, you might not be thinking clearly. It's a very tense situation. You can have someone read a situation and picture themselves there, and they might say, oh yeah, I would definitely do this, but then you're actually in the situation. A lot of different factors, situational factors, are into account, and they might react totally differently. So although this is a good strategy to kind of try and picture what they would do, it's not always the best approach to take for that. They talk about how we know very little about the process whereby officers learn their jobs, and much of what we know concerns the development of attitudes. So that's why, it's important to keep studying these kinds of things and, officers' day-to-day practices, because we don't know a lot about how they make their decisions or the different factors that go into them making their decisions. So research should continue looking at that and looking at it in different ways, maybe some of the ways that were mentioned in this article as well. So moving from that article, we're going to talk about the procedural justice in Dutch victims article. So this one touched on procedural justice, which is the judge's fairness of procedures. So they previously saw that regardless of the outcome of the dispute, the victim always seemed more satisfied with the decision when they were included in the decision. So outcomes weren't really the only things people were worried about. It was, this concept of procedural justice, the process of how the victims were treated. Do they think everything was handled fairly? Did not even does the outcome come out right, but just pretty much like the process of getting to that outcome. Was it fair, pretty much? So fair procedures tend to enhance the legitimacy of authority. So if a victim was treated fairly, with respect, and was involved in like the process, they tend to have a better look of law enforcement agencies and institutions, because this concept of procedural justice does influence this law-abiding behavior. If they see the cops as unfair, they might have a more cynical look at the cops, and they may tend to act out towards law enforcement as well. So the main research question in this article was based on the legal procedure that leads victims to consider the process to be fair. And they want to know what procedural justice meant to the victims. So they used the secondary data of a Dutch victimology study to kind of do their analysis. So in Dutch criminal law, victims are viewed as special target group for services or activities of the police and criminal justice authority. So there was guidelines that facilitated the participation of victims in criminal justice procedure. So their part was largely passive, but it had a big emphasis on notification. They wanted police and the prosecutors to notify the victim of every step of the process and keep them involved. The police were required to ask the victim if they wished to be kept informed of the developments of their case, and if they wanted restitution from the offender. If they did want restitution, the police were told to, be extra careful about getting that restitution for the offender or for the victim. The prosecution was required to continue addressing the wishes of the victim throughout the whole trial and the process of preparing for the trial. The victim must be notified of all important developments, such as trial dates and sentences, and they were required to hear the victim's viewpoint, which cannot be stressed enough. The victim in this criminal justice system have a voice, and that's the biggest aspect of this procedural justice, is giving these victims voices throughout the process so they don't feel neglected, they don't feel like the system forgot about them, and they feel like the outcome will be more fair then. So in past victimology research, they talk about how victims experience a wide range of emotions, including fear, isolation, and uncertainty. So unsympathetic reactions by law enforcement might heighten the suffering, and they talk about secondary victimization. So this is a big concern because these victims have been through, serious crimes. They may have been physical, property, whatever they are, but they're already suffering, and then for law enforcement to come in and kind of push them aside or accuse them or just don't really treat them with respect, it exposes them to the secondary victimization, which has been a big concern in our criminal justice system, with a lot of talk about like rape kits and the way rape victims have been treated by law enforcement officers. So it's definitely something that Dutch law has seemed to kind of focus on, that maybe we should bring over to our criminal justice system and kind of emphasize a little bit more as well. The victims just want to be treated with respect. They have an interest. They're particularly concerned with interest and understanding shown by the police officer. They just want the police officer to kind of show that they are important, they are a part of this process, and they're not just going to be thrown to the side. Victim notification is emphasized, where the victims feel they should receive information in exchange for the considerable time and effort that they're giving authorities in this very difficult time for them. They are going through whatever they're going through, whatever they suffered, and now in that hard time they have to try and deal with police officers and tell them what happened, and maybe go see, depending on what the offense was, maybe go to the hospital and get treated there. And it's just very overwhelming, and it's a lot of different aspects that the victim has to deal with, and it's important to recognize that they're doing this in a very difficult place for them. They also feel that the police did not perceive it necessary to keep in touch, and their satisfaction with police decreased because of this. So a lot of past research showed that victims really didn't feel like police cared about them to keep them up to date with the procedures as well. So I thought it was interesting. They said 50% agreed with the statement that victims should have a say in sentencing, but 60% agreed that the victim should always be invited to attend the trial. So we have a lot of people saying that, yeah, they should be able to attend the trial, but it seems to be split on whether they should have a say in sentencing or not. Some may say that they should have a say in sentencing because they were personally impacted, it affected them, they should have a say in impacting the person who committed this offense. But others might have a say, I don't need to be involved in that part. I just want to be involved in the process to make sure the steps were properly taken up until the sentencing. Maybe they recognize they may be too emotional or invested in the situation to be able to do the sentencing. But it was interesting that it was split down the middle on that aspect as well. People are primarily concerned about their long-term social relationship with authorities or institutions, and this is kind of why they want that respect from law enforcement. Procedural judgment is based on 3 different factors. They talk about standing, trust, and neutrality. Standing is pretty much the concern about recognition of one's status and membership in a valued group. So it's being treated with dignity and respect, showing that, you are a part of this group. You're not an outsider, you're not an outcast. I'm going to treat you like an equal, like with respect and dignity. Trust is an individual's concern about authority's intention. So it's the ability to trust the officers, trust that they're going to do the right thing, trust that they're going to do everything in their power to take care of the situation. And then neutrality is, honesty, absence of bias, and making informed decisions based on the facts of the case. So it's pretty much objectivity that they're looking at in this. So they talk about a relational model for this, but there are a couple of problems with that. And the relational model is the factors that I just talked about. But there are a couple of problems, like there's ambiguity with the concept of trust. There's also an issue of control. So there's 2 different types of control. There's process control and there's decision control. Process control is the extent to which disputants are given control over the content of the dispute resolution. So this is how much they had the opportunity to present, their feelings and input into the process of the trial, the investigation, things like that. And there's also decision control, and that's the extent to which the parties are free to influence the outcome of the result. So this would be them being involved in sentencing, things like that. They found that participants are willing to sacrifice this decision control to third parties such as the courts, the juries, the judge, provided they maintain some influence in the process. So they still have that process control. They're willing to give up the decision control. They're not really focused on the outcome. They don't want to really be a part of that. They just want to make sure they're a part of the process and looking over and making sure everything's followed right. They emphasize these 3 factors, the standing, neutrality, and trust, but they don't make any claim that they're distinct entities. They kind of say that it may be the case that people just lump all these concerns together when they assess the overall quality of their relationship with an authority. So throughout this paper, the authors kind of try and figure out which side of the fence they're on. So they look at the relative importance of a few factors. Representation, which is your process and decision control. It's how much the victim was represented throughout this process. The consistency, impartiality, which is bias suppression, honesty, and efforts made by authorities to be fair. There's decision accuracy, correctability, and ethicality. And looking at all these, they can kind of be meshed into the 3 original categories of standing, neutrality, and control now was replaced with trust. So those 3 can kind of be a wide umbrella for the rest of the elements. But of all those factors, control, effort to be fair, and ethicality and honesty have the strongest influence on procedural justice judgments. One of the issues in this article used previous research from Tyler and Lind. One of the biggest problems that the authors talk about with their research was that they didn't differentiate between victims of crime and just citizens, which is a problem because we all know like citizens might have a very different view of law enforcement than victims of crime. And even if you're asking citizens like, oh, you were a victim of crime, like I talked about earlier, it's not really the same. You can say one thing, but actually how you would feel afterwards could be totally different. However, they found that the citizens are more concerned with issues of decision quality, bias, and correctability when dealing with the court system. And demographic variables didn't really have an impact on procedural fairness. Now, this may just be because of the location, and maybe if it was brought over to the U.S., being like the melting pot we are, it may be a little bit different with that one as well. Demographics may have influenced the procedural fairness. So the authors changed the original model. Like I said earlier, they kept standing and neutrality, but they replaced trust with control. So they looked at the secondary data, like I said before, of a larger study of the victim of crime within Dutch criminal justice system. So examine how these new measures affect the treatment of victims by police and prosecutors, and how this affects the victim's attitudes and law-abiding behavior. So in the Dutch criminal justice system, they enacted these laws that I talked about earlier, and they just kind of want to see like how that actually affected victims' interpretations of police. So the way they did this is they split it into 2 interviews. The first interview was completed once the respondent's case entered into the prosecutor's office. And then the second interview was held after his or her case has been taken into consideration by the public prosecutor. So originally the study started out with 638 victims of felonies, which I thought was interesting that they only used felonies, because victims of maybe misdemeanors and property crimes may have been a little different. I get why they did felonies, because it's more serious crime and it's more likely to affect the victims. But it'd be interesting, maybe in the future if someone did one that encompassed all victims of maybe misdemeanors and property crimes as well. The only 2 selection criteria they had for their sample was the type of offense and whether the victim was an adult or not. So going through the selection criteria, they went down to a sample of 193 participants. They had their dependent variables, which is their procedural justice, which they measured by asking the respondents how fairly they feel they were treated and how fair the procedures were. Then their independent variables were the factors I talked about in the model, which are standing, which was operationalized by interest and friendliness. Neutrality, which encompassed honesty, lack of bias, and decision accuracy. And then we had control, which was the process control, decision control, as well. So what they found was for police, only substantial correlations for absence of bias are with honesty and decision accuracy. For the prosecution, there was a strong correlation between the predictor variables of and procedural justice. So especially bias and honesty were weakly correlated with the procedural justice, but there was a high correlation between the standing variables, so the variables of interest and friendliness, and control variables, which were your process control and your decision control. However, they found no evidence that victims want control over the outcome of the case, and that was stressed very important. They were mainly focused on the process control. So after getting all of this data, the authors formed a new variable of respect. So the main concern of this article was to find out what it is about a procedure that leads Dutch victims to consider it to be fair. And by this, they explored the different interpretations of the police, how they interpreted the process, things like that. They were concerned about being treated with dignity and respect, and to a lesser extent with neutrality of the authority. So the main focus, they wanted to just, be treated like a human being. They wanted respect, they wanted dignity. Respect was the most important in the police group, and this was because face-to-face contact with the police was more likely to occur. The opportunity to express their views and to feel that their views are being taken into consideration was also an important factor as well. Decision control appeared to be of little importance. The victim's desire to be recognized in the criminal justice system doesn't stem from an interest in gaining control over the outcome. In one of the previous research that the authors cited, they said that the victims act in a self-interest fashion when they want to be a part of the process. They said they want to be a part of the process so that they can be a part of the outcome, and they want the outcome to be harsh. But the research in this article didn't find that to be the case at all. They just wanted in the process, and they wanted to be treated with respect, and they wanted to be treated the way that they should be, going through such a traumatic incident. They appear to focus on the process itself and the message it sends to victims about their status in the group. Like I said, by including them into the process, it says, you are a valued member of society, and we're going to take this serious, and we want you to be involved with our process to, make sure everything is fair and, goes as according to plan. So like I talked about earlier, with the kind of spectrum of standing, neutrality, and trust on one side, and then on the other side, people lumping all their concerns together. The results here tend to fall in the middle of that. So the standing, neutrality, and trust aren't discrete categories, but it's not that they just lump them all together either. The data seems to fall somewhere in the middle, and the authors take a two-factor model approach, which appears to be respect and neutrality that show the most important response. And that's it.